So this is ready to go. First thing I'm going to do is tear off lots of binding tape. This binding tape is pretty tough stuff. Super sticky, super strong, and it resists tearing on the sharp edge of the binding, which is quite nice. It will totally stick to itself, so you do have to be careful when you're lining these up on the bench not to put them overlapping each other, otherwise you'll end up with a handful of binding tape. Now the binding tape pieces I put all along my bench, I put them up on the wall, I tear off more pieces than I think I'm going to use, and then I always end up using them. Now this is one of the other reasons why it's a great idea to shellac the top of your guitar, because this tape does have a tendency sometimes to peel off the softer spruce fibers. If we've shellacked the top already, it has much less tendency to do that, and it does not stick to the shellac like it does the raw wood fibers. I'm just going to use yellow glue for this one. Now, I do have a different method that I use super glue on, and if I'm using a little fancier inlay on the top of the purfling, I do tend to use the super glue method. If I'm doing that, I want to shellac all the channels so that the super glue does not wick up into this end grain. But for this one, I'm just using the standard yellow glue. Now the pieces of purfling that are going to go on this bottom channel, I do straighten out a little bit. When they come out of the roll, they are curled the wrong way for this, because they're curled this way, and I want to get these kind of flat so I can bend them around the guitar. We do have to be pretty careful because they are a little delicate and they can snap if they're forced to be bent too far one way or the other. Okay, that one's ready. And as you're putting them on the guitar, they do have a tendency to twist, so keep an eye on those. Quite often during the binding process, you're always going to be wanting to tuck the purfling back in because of that hydraulic pressure from the glue is usually going to push those up. I wanted to mention one thing that you're going to want to have before we start this binding process is this fabric tape, or twill tape it's called in the fabric stores. It's just cloth, it's about 1 inch. I think some of the Luthier supply stores also sell it. I have about 100 feet of it, and that's really about all you'll need, maybe 110 if you really want to make sure you can stretch across the lower bout one more time. But I'll show you how this is used later, but this is one thing I wanted to make sure to point out before we got too far into it. Twill tape. I start with binding the top because the softer wood is more vulnerable, and adding the hardwood binding helps protect the edges, which are particularly prone to damage. We've put in so much effort to cut our binding channels accurately and cleanly, so not that there is ever a good time to do it, but now is not the time to let our guard down. The binding process is messy, like really messy. And honestly, even for someone who's done it hundreds of times, it can still be a bit nerve-wracking because once the glue goes down, we're on the clock. You'll see later in the video that it gets even crazier when you add purfling that seems to have a mind of its own, whipping all over the place and making everything feel just more chaotic and more messy. And once I get that started, I'll usually put a piece of tape down here. And it gets a little squirrely here in the waist. It is real easy for it to snap. Be careful about how hard you try to convince it to stay down there. And that's where the glue stops. That's where my tape is going to stop. Okay, I'm going to let that sit there. Now here's the upper binding channel, purfling channel I should say. Really helps to have a smaller applicator for this particular part. Okay.
At this point, I already have the lower purfling in place, but as I'm coming around the upper bout with the upper purfling, the lower one started to come out. It pulled away from the miter at the end wedge, it started pulling itself out of the waist, and was starting to twist itself again and just getting unruly. Okay, freeze. It's a bit of a crapshoot whether to do the 2 strips of purfling and the binding all individually or all together. More tape can keep the purflings in place, but it also slows down the actual binding install since you have to pull the tape off, put it back on. It can go good or it can go bad in either case. Anyway, it had only been about 3 or 4 minutes since I applied the glue, so I was still in good shape here. It can be tempting to invoke the sunk cost theory here and forge ahead since you've already gotten this far, but that's just panic talking. If you get to that point, take that breath, keep your cool. It's all good if you take a step backward and just start over with your last step. That's what I decided to do here. I pulled the tape, removed the lower purfling, reset the miter cut at the end wedge, and put fresh glue down in preparation for the binding. And I'll just do them all at the same time. You know, it's always tempting to just edit everything out and give you the happy, shiny version of whatever's happening. But a large part of Luthiery is recovering from the unexpected. It's a huge part of the teaching aspect of what I do, and it's an even bigger part of the learning process. So I want to be as real as I can, warts and all, whenever possible. I have to apologize here for the terrible camera angle. I will try to be better about planning out the shot in conjunction with my gluing operations. I apologize. Take care that you apply glue to all of the surfaces of the purfling and the binding that touch each other or the guitar body. It's really easy to get the purfling in place and then forget about gluing up the side of it before we attach the binding right next to it. Getting the binding and the purfling miter and everything centered and lined up is critical. So take the time to ensure that it's as good as it can be. That's a big reason why it was better for me to take a step back than it was to force something that wasn't quite right. The visual mistakes you make will haunt you forever. So take the extra few seconds and do it right. I promise you it's worth it. It doesn't really matter here if you're stretching the tape from the side to the top or from the top to the side. The biggest thing we're concerned about is just making sure there's enough pressure on that tape when we stick it down that everything stays in place. There's a bit of finesse to it to figure out how hard you can pull and at what angle before it tears, but you'll find your way around it pretty quickly once you start using it and experimenting with it.
The shellac on the top of the guitar is also going to do a good job of not letting the glue impregnate into the top and cause any kind of staining or anything like that, and it will be easier to get off.
Right about this time in the binding process, it is super easy to get stressed out. Try your best not to, and just take a few deep breaths. Don't feel like you're so under the gun that you can't get this done before the glue sets. You've got a little bit more time than you think. Just keep everything pressed together, make incremental progress as you go along the binding, push things back when they start to stick out, and you'll get there.
The waist is quite difficult to do a good job of getting the binding to stick to all sides, just because of all those real tight angles happening, and clamping something tape-wise to an inside corner like this is much more difficult than an outside corner like this upper bout. I did stop gluing up here earlier just to make sure that all these were going to kind of line up where I wanted them to, and that I didn't need to cut anything else off. That looks good. Ready to move on to this side. That was fun, huh? All right. Now, I need a lot more tape. This one I'm going to continue this upper channel.
Now I'm going to add glue along the lower purfling channel as well as the main binding channel. When I spread this glue out, I'm also going to make sure that I get glue on the side of the upper purfling as well. This is just to make sure that all the pieces that are placed next to each other have enough glue on them before we tape them up. Crossing our fingers that some squeeze out is going to come up between the seams and do the job for us is a terrible plan. So get the glue on there and spread it out as best you can. The end wedge is quite decorative, and whether you like it or not, it's a focal point. So it's going to draw attention to itself. We want to make sure that all of these pieces line up as best they can. The purfling miter is lined up correctly, the binding ends meet as perfectly as they can, and that there aren't gaps where maybe we haven't done a good job of taping and clamping. We want to get all of those squeezed together and then add a little bit more glue on the purfling that's just hanging loose there as you go, because most likely that hasn't received any glue at all yet. Some squeeze out is going to come out, but again, we don't want to rely on that squeeze out to glue our surfaces together. So once those are lined up, we get a piece of binding tape as we go along and we start installing.
You can see I've kind of got these things springing out at me all over. But as we get them pressed into place, they kind of fall together pretty well.
The waist area is critical to make sure that everything is sitting as close together and as flush as possible, because this is the area that tends to have gaps as things try to pull away from the guitar body due to the nature of the spring effect inherent in that tight waist. If your binding is sticking out proud of the sides, it will create a major headache later. You'll need to sand or scrape through them in order to make the sides flat, so you need to close all those gaps. It pays to go back and double and triple check afterward as well, because they can be a little sneaky when they heave from the back pressure of the glue.
Here's the part where they start trying to press out because there's so much hydraulic pressure, liquid pressure behind there with that glue. Just poking it back in. Now once you get all of this stuff in place, go back around real quick, make sure that there's nothing super crazy jumping out at you that you have to make sure we attend to. Things look good here. All right, and this is a fabric tape. It's about 1 inch wide. I use this twill tape to wrap up the bindings and give them some extra clamping pressure.
I'll first give it a couple wraps around the waist and wrap it onto itself to hold the twill tape in place. Then when I come off of the waist, I find a spot on the far side of the lower bout, but at a spot where it will still hold. Then come back up towards the waist on one side and back towards the lower bout on the other. And you're working your way up one side and down the other, crossing them right in the middle, so that when we're done with the lower bout, it's kind of a mirror image of each other. Stretch the twill tape as you go along, putting pressure on those bindings with the tape and with your hands to hold them down. Just keep wrapping and crossing the tape from one side to the opposite corner, working along the lower bout. You'll want to leave a little bit of room, maybe a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch at the most, between windings as you're wrapping along.
Now there's a point where we can't really wrap this around here anymore before it'll just start slipping. So when we reach that point, I will Start going around the upper bout. Trying to find that point where it's going to hold and not slip. There's about 100 feet in that roll of twill tape. And that usually gets me to where I need to go. So once I hit that spot where it's just going to start slipping, then I will go end to end. And when I finish, I'm going to wrap it around that. Put a piece of binding tape over it. And that should hold it. Now there's two other clamps I'd like to put on at the very end. One is going block to block.
This clamp is helping ensure that the joints where the bindings come together on the tail and the heel come together as well as they can.
And then just a little bit of extra pressure on the waist. Not too much on the waist, otherwise we can crack that. So just be careful of those. This all looks good. All the seams look great. About 45 minutes on this dry time, and then we can unwrap it, take the tape off, take the clamps off, and get started on the back. So we'll leave that dry, come back to it, and catch you in the next video.